So students, we revised chapter 1 of history grade 9 French Revolution, and we have discussed the reign of terror, and then directory came, and after the political instability shown by the directory, it gave rise to the military dictatorship, military dictator, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. Then in 1804 he crowned himself as the Emperor of France. Now the topic which we have to discuss is, did women have a revolution? Did women have a revolution? What was the contribution of the women in the revolution? Were they the active participants or not? So obviously the women were the active participants from the very beginning, and because by participating only they can keep their concerns in front of the revolutionary government or whichever national assemblies were formed. So the women were the active participants throughout, from the beginning only, in the French Revolution. Now if you see, most of the women of the third estate, they have to work for the living. So mostly the poor women of the third estate, the women of the less prosperous section of the society, they have to work for living. Either they were working in the homes, they were working as maids, as domestic help, they were selling fruits, flowers and vegetables in the market, they were stitching the clothes, they were washing the clothes and ironing the clothes. So this kind of work they were doing. So most of the women of the third estate, they have to look after their homes, they have to fetch water, they have to cook, they have to take care of their children. And only the wealthier section of the third estate, the girls belonging to the wealthier section of the third estate, or the nobles, they only have access to education, and they can only go and study in the convent schools. But the women of the third estate, the less prosperous section of the society, they don't have access to education. So if they don't have access to education, they will not be having any skill, and if they don't have any skill, so they were doing all the meager jobs, and their earnings were also very meager. Then after that, they don't have any access to the education, but they were denied the voting rights, they were denied some of the essential rights. So that's why they formed the political clubs. So, and they started some newspapers also to voice their concerns, whatever rights they wanted to voice their concerns. They formed the political clubs, and the most famous of the political clubs was the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. This was the most important club. So basically the women, why they formed the political clubs? Because they were very disappointed with the constitution of 1791, which reduced the status of women to the passive citizens, where they were not granted any of the rights or any of the voting rights. So that's why, to voice their concern, they formed the political clubs. They started writing in the newspaper, then they started the movements also, the protest movement also, so as to get their voting rights. And the revolutionary government also brought many of the changes. They started the schooling for girls, and marriage was also made legal, divorce also made illegal, and civil law they were made, and fathers can't marry their daughter against their will. So these kind of reforms they have brought. And education access also, now girl should have, and they can start any of the ventures, they have a right to acquire the skill also. So these reforms were brought by the revolutionary government also, but still the main concern was the voting rights, for which they continued their suffragette movement. And finally it was in 1946 that the right to vote was given to the women in France. In 1848 France became republic, but at that time also right to vote was given only to the adult males above the age of 21 years. And then right to work was also guaranteed under 1848 constitution, but the women, they were denied this right at that time also. And finally in 1946 only the women were given this right. So the next topic which we have to discuss is abolition of slavery. So here the slavery, if you remember, for a brief period in 1794, the Jacobins, that is the convention, they abolished the slavery, and then after 10 years in 1804 it was reintroduced by the Napoleon, and in 1848 only it was completely abolished when France became republic. So here this was the abolition of slavery was one of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime. So if you remember, in the Jacobins, the less prosperous section of the society was there. So it was very urgent for them, immediate for them take this step to abolish the slavery in France, because the National Assembly, which was formed after the Revolution of 1789, they did not legislate any of the laws regarding abolition of the slavery, because the National Assembly at that time was dominated by the wealthier middle class. So they did not pass any of the laws regarding the abolition of the slavery, because in the National Assembly themselves, many of the businessmen were there, merchants were there, and traders were there, who already were exploiting the slave labor in the plantations which were owned by them. So here, this was one of the very important step which was taken by the Jacobins during 1794. So the triangular trade, why the need was there for the slaves? Because it was very difficult for the Europeans to go for the physical and hard work. So that's why the practice of keeping the slaves was there. So the triangular slave trade was carried on between Europe, Africa and America. So triangular slave trade, it brought the prosperity to the port cities of France. So this slave trade, it began in the 17th century only. So the port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes, these are the port cities of Bordeaux and Nantes of the French of the France. So they owed their prosperity because of the flourishing slave trade, because whatever demand was there of the plantation crops like sugar, indigo, coffee, this is met by the slave trade only, because the slaves, they used to work in the plantations, and in the entire Europe the demand was there for this of these kind of crops. So that demand was met by the exploitation of the slave labor only, because they used to work in the plantations and then production was there, and then they used to supply it to other parts of the Europe through the port cities of Bordeaux and Nantes. That's why these the port cities of Bordeaux and Nantes, they owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. So that's why the slave trade flourished here, and the economic prosperity came to these port cities. But I told you, finally in 1794, the convention that is formed by the Jacobins, they legislated to free the slaves in the French overseas colonies and the possessions. So 1794 they have abolished it, and again Napoleon reintroduced in 1804, and finally it was abolished in 1848. So now the next topic which we have to discuss is the revolution and the everyday life. That what changes came after the revolution of 1789. So the year following the 1789 in France, so many such changes in the lives of men, women and children, in their clothes, in their living. So many changes came, like we have seen the less prosperous section of the society, they start wearing the long printed trousers, long striped trousers, red cap, the symbol of liberty they start wearing. So many changes were there in the lives of men and women, and one such change was the abolition of censorship. So the ban was removed from media. Now easily you can circulate whatever written material you want to circulate. So in old regime, the written material was published after approval was given from the censors of the king. So censors officials the king used to hire, and nobody can circulate anything against the monarchy. So old regime, this was the case that written material was not allowed to be circulated which criticizes the monarchy specially. But now, according to the Constitution of 1791, the right to freedom of speech was given, and you can express your beliefs and ideas. So the articles were there in the newspaper, books, printed pictures were there. It flooded the towns of the France. So the print culture was there. Printing press also came by the Gutenberg, invented by the Gutenberg in 1440. So after that there was a spread of the print culture, and here also due to this the awareness was there. Now the rights were also there, so people started writing in huge number. Literature explosion was there, newspapers, books, printed pictures, this all flooded the towns of the France. Then after that, whatever viewpoint you have to keep through the printed material only, and if any opposing viewpoint is there, that also has to be given by the through the print medium only. So this way the debates and discussion were also carried out in the printed medium. Plays, songs, festive procession attracted large number of the people. So to create the feeling of nationalism and the binding among the French people, the plays, songs, festive processions attracted a large number of people in order to bind themselves. So this was the revolution, and after the revolution, whatever the changes came in the everyday life of the people. And now concluding the chapter, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself the Emperor of France in 1804, and then he in 1804 brought the Civil Code of 1804, that is also known as Napoleonic Code, in which he brought certain reforms. He simplified the administrative division. He did away with the privileges based on birth, and he granted the property right to property. He freed peasants from serfdom. He removed the feudalism, and guild restrictions were also removed. Transport and communication were also improved. So many changes he brought in France, and people liked him. He was the modernizer of the France. But after that, we have seen certain drawbacks also of the Napoleon rule. He reintroduced slavery, he increased the taxes. Then after that, forcefully he was recruiting the people in the French army, because his dream was to conquer the Europe, and then he imposed censorship also. So these were some of the drawbacks, but still, nevertheless, the legacies of the French Revolution, the ideals of the French Revolution, that is liberty, equality, and fraternity, it was inspired. It was inspiring many people throughout the world, and Tipu Sultan and Raja Ram Mohan Roy also followed the footsteps of the French Revolution, and they also get their inspiration, because we were also the colony of Britain at that time, and we also get inspiration from these kind of world events to bring a change in our society.